The future is here. The technology, the ideas, the people, they're all here. What they need now is the right leader.
Value gets created by destroying risks rather than just focusing on the positive.
I really don't like when people romanticize failure. I can't stand the phrase fail fast.
I have this phrase that failure comes from a failure to imagine failure.
World Reimagined with Gautam Mukunda, a leadership podcast for a changing world, an original podcast from Nasdaq.
Yes, tech enables amazing, incredible new things we could never do before, but it's always, for me, the people part that is far more interesting and far more powerful.
It's hard to get more peaceful than this, especially for Saturday night on a college campus. They're rarely tranquil places, but even here, things slow down at 4 a.m. The theaters and the bars and the arenas all emptied out a long time ago, and the last few stragglers have made their way home. Everybody is asleep. Well, almost everybody. Most of the people at this hackathon got here earlier this morning. Yesterday morning, to be precise. They're working on programs that will teach drones to draw. They're building robots that can mimic the motions of a human hand. And they're designing VR experiences that will bring music and poetry to life. And many of them have no plans to sleep. Hackathons today don't typically involve much hacking in the traditional sense. And yet, many of the participants here are, in a way, hacking themselves. They've retrofitted and reprogrammed their circadian rhythms to eat only when necessary, avoid rest if at all possible, and squeeze out every last ounce of productivity that their brains have to give. For a Saturday night, it's not exactly everyone's cup of tea. So what's drawn these people here? What drives them to band together, to jettison sleep, and to keep going no matter what?
The first thing I love to find is people that have a chip on their shoulder.
Josh Wolfe is a founding partner and managing director of Lux Capital, a VC firm that invests in deep technology, the technologies that seem to belong in science fiction. Josh and his partners have helped build companies that optimized antibody drugs, established airspace infrastructure for drones, and decontaminated water by 99% in the wake of the Fukushima disaster. And when he's searching for the next leader with the next revolutionary idea, there's one thing Josh looks for.
I like to say that chips on shoulders put chips in pockets, in part because it is often predictive of somebody that is going to be relentless against adversity. They might have been the overweight kid, in a Friday night football town. They might have been the only minority in a mostly white neighborhood. They come from a broken family. They had a disability. I find that those people who are somehow disaffected or broken early on and survive, not in spite of it, but because of it, are some of both the greatest entrepreneurs and creative minds and inventors. And so I like understanding people's human story. And I find that people that are super well adapted and lived, relatively pain-free lives and grew up with a silver spoon in their mouth, those are not entrepreneurs that I want to back. So it's a heuristic that I have, which is I like people that have something to prove. And I find that no matter how much success they achieve or wealth they attain, that doesn't tend to go away. It tends to be a fire that burns in them. And it's something I identify with and like. In the earliest days when we're funding a company, particularly when there's very little beyond a napkin sketch or a prototype, you are looking at how they are thinking about building the business. And there are certain things that I can tell you in the same way one of our partners used to run all of special operations as SOCOM, and you'll talk to SOCOM people at BUDS, which is the training and selecting SEALs, and they will say, it's hard to tell who will make it, but you can often tell who won't. And the people who won't are often the people that are the big muscular guys with lots of tattoos that are signaling how tough they are. And then when they actually get in there, it's the scrawnier, scrappier, mentally tough people that actually survive training and make it through and get selected as SEALs. I can say the same sort of thing. When people walk in, I can typically tell who I think is not going to make it. It's people that are very conservative, people that are very reverent, people who talk about, I want to save the world or change the world. All those things to me are sort of negative signals that turn me off and wanting to back somebody. And in part because I find that they're not going to be scrappy, resourceful, persuasive. Again, they've got to convince people to leave their jobs. They've got to convince people to convince their spouses that they're picking up and moving across the country. They've got to convince people to part with their capital, media to cover them, partners to spend time with them or take a risk on an upstart. And that's a special kind of person who is both a really good salesperson, very credible. And then I love when they are constantly thinking about the risks. They're constantly worrying so that I know that I can sleep well at night because they're not. And if somebody was to see a competitor, for example, and say, oh, it's wonderful to see that. It's very validating. That is like nails on chalkboard for me. I don't want anybody to ever say competition is validating. I want them to say, here's the 4 reasons why we're going to beat those people, or these are the 2 decisions that those competitors are making, and we're going to crush them. So I like people that are psychotically competitive.
Psychotically competitive. Well, you're not describing Microsoft.
And Mike Pell would know. A designer, author, and hacker, he invented the PDF at a hackathon in 1990. Today, he leads the Microsoft Garage in New York City, part of Microsoft's worldwide innovation program for moving ideas forward quickly to foster a culture of experimentation. He's cultivated a healthy appreciation for competitiveness and the ways leaders can nourish it inside their teams.
A lot of things you said, Josh, reminded me of people that we run into inside Microsoft. They are scrappy and they are relentless and they are, I would say, very persuasive in not only their arguments. We have a saying in the garage, we like doers, not talkers. We've all talked ourselves to death, over the years. That was sort of the hallmark of, America, corporate society, right? It's talk, 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 not doing anything. When we look at leaders, people who we want to bet on to really take ideas forward, they're typically the doers. They're the people who just dug in and figured out a way to do it without having the resources, without having the support, without having the champions. And despite all of that, they did it. Right or wrong, good or bad, they pursued, an opportunity and they pushed and they did it. And that's what we sort of look for, is the people who are always proactive, are not looking for something to unlock them, like give them headcount and money and resources. They found a way to do it despite all of that. That's sort of, for us, the best demonstration of leadership ability is actually just doing it.
I'd sort of push on this a little bit because, psychotically competitive strikes me as sort of a fascinating set of questions as to how you get these people. But Josh and Mike, both of you, I keep thinking the people you are describing, right, is essentially you're betting on high-end variance, right? The person who's very conservative, who always does reverent, things like that, they'll do well in society, but they're not going to build a multi-billion-dollar company. Is there a trade-off there that you're thinking about where the sort of welfare? I almost wanted to joke that my advice if someone was pitching you, Josh, is that they should not go to therapy before they talk bollocks.
Yeah, in fact, I often somewhat half-jokingly say that this entire movement, which is healthy for the individual, of mindfulness and meditation and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and things that are effectively modern clinical stoicism, are great for the disaffected individual. But for society writ large, you want troves of disaffected people who are angry and bitter and frustrated and want to improve their lot in life and are very driven. So yeah, I think that some of the most celebrated entrepreneurs are maligned. Some of our most famous ones that have created iconic tech companies have all kinds of personal afflictions. Some of them were adopted. Some of them were hyper-competitive with their parents or their father. Some of them were completely made fun of as nerds. But there's something that really drives them. So yeah, I do like disaffected people. And if they're coming in and they're calm and they're well-adjusted, at least for me, it actually is a negative signal that, and you're right, that if you were to look at it as a bell curve, as sort of the outliers, there's a reason why you get these certain personalities that cluster around the safe middle. Evolutionarily, of course, it was safe to be inside of the herd. And there's the risk takers who go out on a limb because that's where the fruit is. There are people that are both comfortable finding the balance between fitting in and standing out. There are people that much prefer to stand out, and the way that they dress, the way that they speak. And again, whatever their life circumstances, their blueprint, their genetics that give them that confidence or the aloofness to what other people have to say about them, they're the ones that are able to stand out and think differently. And so they often, because they are high beta individuals, luck plays a huge role in this. And they may end up being the great entrepreneur. They may end up becoming the billionaire CEO. They also may end up dead in prison, in jail, at the other end of the spectrum. And so that's the risk when you get outliers. It's not always obvious that they're going to positively skew towards success. They may crash and burn too.
It's interesting. A good friend of mine, Billy Carn, studied mavericks For many years, she interviewed 99 Mavericks to try to figure out, as a researcher, what made them behave the way they do, what made them think and act and do the things that they had to do. It was sort of, driving them. And what she found, almost to the person, was they didn't know any other way to be. It was just the way they were wired, probably from when they were very young. There is something to not only your situation and environment causing you, perhaps, as Josh was talking about, to be disaffected, but some people are just wired in a way that they don't know any other manner to behave other than to be that person to go try to change things.
An innovation, by definition, has to be different from what everyone else is already doing. If it isn't, it's not an innovation. So innovators have to be the sort of people who look at what everyone else is doing and say, I'm going to try something different. But systems, particularly the ones inside most big companies, don't handle people like that very well. The whole point of bureaucracy is, as the great German sociologist Max Weber pointed out, to reduce risk. And reduced risk has advantages. But if you can't take chances, you can't innovate. The vast majority of innovations that have ever been attempted fail. We just never hear about them because they don't make the news. But the ones that succeed have changed the world. CEOs, investors, and social scientists, myself included, have spent a great deal of time trying to identify these risk takers so that we can give them the resources they need to do big things, while also making sure the potential fallout from those risks is contained. This is the business that Josh and Mike are in, and it's almost never an easy task.
The thing that's often most inspiring is the Horatio Alger stories of individuals, the people that, again, have chips on their shoulders and want to prove something. And I have to say that most of our failures are misjudgments of people, too. It's very often not the technology didn't work. Really great people figure out if technology doesn't work, the problem still exists. They find other technology. It's much more often we bet on the wrong people, or they were the wrong leader, or we were fooled by them. So oftentimes our failure is a failure to make a bet on the right people. So the primacy of people over technology, for sure.
Yeah. Hey, Josh, can we talk about something you just touched on? I really don't like when people romanticize failure. I can't stand the phrase fail fast. I don't think there's a single person I've met at Microsoft who wants to fail. I don't think any of us want to fail at anything, really. I mean, it's true that you learn an incredible amount if you pay attention to what didn't go well. But how do you feel about that whole fail fast thing?
I'm probably in that camp. First thing I would say is it's the one thing that Peter Thiel and I disagree about greatly. He thinks you should study successes and seek to model them, maybe even mimetically. I think that you learn more from the inverting and studying why people failed. What was the mistake they made? And you can sometimes go back and sort of run the counterfactual. And if it was something that was within their control versus some exogenous outside factor, what was the thing that they decided to do? What was the strategic direction that they took, and why did they screw it up? So I think that, number one, we learn more from our failures. It also predisposes me when I think about value creation inside of companies. I have this phrase that failure comes from a failure to imagine failure, which is to say, if you can think about all the things that can go wrong and be as imaginative and creative as possible to think about, why would this fail? If we were doing a postmortem 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now, why did this fail? Was it the technology? Was it competition? Was it people? Was it product? Was it the design factor? Was it supply chain? Was it components? Was it inability to sell a story to investors? What went wrong?
It's that my hard drive died right before the demo.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever that failure point is, anticipating a failure can sometimes help prevent its occurrence. You throw time, you throw talent, you throw money at it. Not always. But it's interesting because when we underwrite investment, if it fails for a reason that we anticipated, I say, okay, we underwrote that risk. We knew it was a possibility. It didn't work out. Process was good. Outcome was a failure. If we fail for something that was an edge case that we failed to imagine, I consider that a process failure. So I think it is important to sort of focus on failure. Not you don't want people that are curmudgeons and bitter and cynical leading companies, because they're the cheerleaders and the rally point people that you need to raise money and keep up morale. But I actually do think that value gets created by destroying risks rather than just focusing on the positive. I think failing fast, that to me is a view of let's try lots of experiments and kill the ones that don't work and feed and amplify the ones that do. And of course, we have a model for that, which is evolution and natural selection and amplification that has worked quite well for billions of years on the planet. So I'm long failure.
Like that.
Imagine a game in which you draw a number between 1 and 100. If you draw 100, you get $10 million. If you draw any other number, you go bankrupt. Now, if you were already pretty close to bankruptcy, that seems like a pretty good deal. But suppose you were trying to understand how people became millionaires, and you did that by only studying the wealthy. You'd see a lot of people who played this game and won. You wouldn't see any of the losers. After all, they're not the people you're looking at. They won't be part of your study. So you'd conclude that every single person who played this game became spectacularly rich. And you'd never see the fact that this only happens 1% of the time. Social scientists call this selecting on the dependent variable. And except under special circumstances, it's one of the biggest mistakes you can make. Assessing a situation by only looking at the winners is rarely a good strategy, whether you're playing a game of chance or evaluating the pitch deck someone's just left in your office. It's entirely possible that one of the people in this hackathon is on the verge of a breakthrough idea. And it goes without saying that Mike, Josh, and scores of other folks are interested in figuring out who that is. So how do leaders identify the right people at the right time with the right ideas?
It isn't, in this case, that somebody says, I want to do the wrong thing. It's just when somebody comes in and says, and I'm like, what motivates you? And they give me an answer that is cliched and I just want to change the world. I just want to make it a better place. I am too cynical to believe that.
What if they're super honest with you, Josh, and they just say, I just want to take this idea and cash out?
Well, that also feels a little bit mercenary. But if somebody's like, my mother died of ovarian cancer and I need to find a cure for this, I never want anybody else to suffer from that. Like, that feels more authentic. And it tends to be like this deeply personal mission as opposed to this abstract global one.
Can I just say something really quickly? What Josh just said is exactly what we find in the garage. We won the world's biggest corporate hackathon every year. This is the 9th year we've done it. But the best projects are exactly what Josh just said. They are super personal. They're not about saving the world. They're about saving their family or their friends or their community. They never want this to happen again. Almost to the project, they are always about that super personal reason.
I'm just going to push on both of you. What I just heard is it's not the intent. It's the genericness of the sentiment that you object to.
I think there's an inauthenticity when somebody comes in and gives the cliched thing that they think people want to hear versus the authentic, the one I really love is when people say everybody else is doing X and it makes no sense to me. Like I have this contrarian take and like, why aren't people doing Y? That's a really positive one. And because I know that they have a chip on their shoulder. They want to be proven right. They want to prove other people wrong. Ideally, they want to be not only right, but they want to be rich. But if you think about every great rare disease breakthrough, it wasn't because some doctor was like, I want to save the world. It's because there's some father or mother that is desperately trying to save their child and congeals the world experts. And if they're fortunate enough to be a rich hedge fund manager or wealthy industry or business owner, they take all of their life savings and they pour it into getting these folks who otherwise might be working on something else to work on this thing to save their kid's life. And then we end up with these crazy drug breakthroughs. And it's all motivated by a very personal vendetta against some inequity in life, some sense of unfairness, some trouble, some problem that they're solving. And so I like when people are basically like, I want to make my life better or my family's life better or something that I feel more authentically to be accurate than, this brushstroke of I want to save the world. But if you take an example, and you mentioned patriotism, of like American defense, if you spend time with Palmer Luckey, who founded Oculus, sold it to Facebook, politically controversial, founded Anduril. We were founding investors and have invested significantly in every round. And Palmer and I don't agree on politics, but I can see authentically this is a guy on a mission who is motivated not because of just American greatness. He's a libertarian. He's sort of against big government. He's really against the rise of peer competitors. And he wants to be responsible for providing hardware, software, technological capabilities to beat the CCP in China and any other revanchist enemies that are developing technological capabilities at a time when he also sees his tech community peers eschewing wanting to work on some of these important issues. Microsoft has actually been a great standout example of somebody who very early on, when Google was saying, no, we don't want to work with the Pentagon, and people were walking out, Brad Smith and others were like, no, this is really important, and we're not going to turn our back on the women and men on our front lines.
It strikes me that this is a trait that is enormously powerful but has to be harnessed, I think is the right way to put it, right? If you are convinced that you are right and the world tells you you're wrong, and you are right, you are a genius. But no one's right all the time. Sometimes you actually do have to listen when the world is telling you that you're wrong. So how do you, in yourselves, in the entrepreneurs you mentor, how do you cultivate the ability to make that distinction? To know when it's time that I'm not right about everything, and this might be one of the times that's not true.
It's hard to let go of ideas, isn't it?
My students tease me that I often say that people wed their ideas more faithfully than their spouses.
Yeah. One of the things I noticed in corporate America over the years, it's a real sign of maturity as an employee if you can kill your own idea. And it's so rare that people do that. But it really shows that you're thinking about the bigger picture. I found, being an entrepreneur and then working with entrepreneurs living in Silicon Valley for many years, it is so hard for entrepreneurs to let go. We talk about pivoting and shifting and changing, but there's always that core belief that many entrepreneurs hold on to. And it is super difficult, I think, for many people to let that go.
I don't know that there's a balance to this. When all signs are pointing to failure, when all signs are pointing that a consensus of everybody is doubting you, investors don't want to fund you as a startup, and people are leaving, and you can try to sit with a CEO and say, hey, heart to heart, like, writing's on the wall here. But the very best of them are the ones that, in spite of all of that, or in the face of it, will say, like, I don't care. Failure be damned. I'm going to prove everybody wrong. And it powers them. And so, knowing when to fold, knowing when to quit, it's a really hard thing. It's entirely individual and subjective. It's entirely dependent upon the availability of resources, and it's a really hard thing to do. And I got to tell you, there are some entrepreneurs that we as a firm completely doubted and were ready to count out. And we might have not told them explicitly it's time to shut down. But, we basically thought that they were sort of, walking dead. And we call them cockroach entrepreneurs because they just can't be killed, and they keep surviving, and they shock us. And there's a handful of companies that we've sort of deprioritized within our portfolios and our funds over time. And they may end up being the ones that actually return a lot of capital despite our best judgment. And kudos to them for not giving up. We would have told them to.
There's that point, and we've all seen this, where everybody knows it is clearly not going to work. And the entrepreneur will just not quit. They will just not let go. And sometimes they lose it all. And it's a very sad thing to watch. And like you said, Josh, maybe every once in a while, something happens at the last minute and they pull it out and all of a sudden they're a hero. But, more times than not, it's just that stubborn pride and that blind faith in their own ability that keeps driving them to ruin.
Ever since the phrase Murphy's Law was coined at Edwards Air Force Base in 1949, its origins and exact meaning have been subject to debate. The typical narrative states that in a moment of frustration, Captain Edward Murphy Jr. declared that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. But other people who were there that day disagree. In their version of events, they took Murphy's initial outburst, sanded it down, and adopted it as a sort of mantra for their engineering work. To them, Murphy's Law dictates that if it can happen, it will happen. The anything that can go wrong will go wrong interpretation has become a shorthand for pessimism and defeat, a way to throw up your hands and say, why bother, in the face of a chaotic and indifferent universe. But to say, if it can happen, it will happen, means adjusting your thinking to take the long view. It means being mindful of potential points of failure, but also staying vigilant for good outcomes too. Because if a certain technological problem can be solved, or a particular devastating disease can be cured, then ultimately, at some point, it will be. Josh and Mike's responsibility as leaders isn't to look at the technology in front of them, because everything that's possible will eventually exist on a long enough timeline. Their job is to look at the people and figure out whether or not the person standing in their office on that day is the one who will make that possibility real.
I am a technologist. I'm a designer. I'm a business person. I've started companies. I've done a lot of different things. And I love technology as much as anybody. As a kid, I watched a lot of science fiction movies. I loved, what was possible. But I always feel that technology isn't the biggest driver. It's more on the people side. So I think it's actually perhaps, if we're talking about leadership and technology, it's more on the leadership and people side than on the tech side. Yes, tech enables amazing, incredible new things we could never do before. But it's always, for me, the people part that is far more interesting and far more powerful.
Josh, I'd be really curious about your response to that.
I 100% agree. I wish I had a differing view. I've always been very instinctively drawn towards, understanding cutting edge areas of tech that other people don't understand. But thankfully, my co-founder here at Lux, Peter Hebert, has always been more of a people person. And it doesn't matter really the technology in the end. It always matters the people, because the people are the two-legged mammals who are convincing people to leave their jobs and join them on a mission, convincing other people to will something into existence that other people are skeptical or doubtful of. And so it really is ultimately some part social primate, psychology, influence, storytelling, confidence, leadership, vision, rising when you get knocked down 9 times and getting up that 10th time.
No matter how powerful our technology gets, it will always need people to bring it into being. And given our conversation, I wanted to know who had inspired Josh and Mike to get up that 10th time. Who had most impressed them, and why?
I'll give you 2. One is somebody that's very important because I credit my professional career, which is Bill Conway. Bill is one of the 3 founders of the Carlyle Group. While David Rubenstein's more notorious, Bill is the one who's been the main investor for a very long time and is now retaken the helm as CEO. But just an extraordinary guy who's not only a rational capital allocator and a good human, and I've never met anybody that wasn't like, he's amazing, but he always did the right thing. It didn't matter what the deal docs say. It didn't matter what the term sheet said. It didn't matter. It was just do the right thing. And I think that was a good long-term greedy approach. He didn't want to make less money. He didn't want to lose money, but it was a good ethical framework for making more money over time. And I'm grateful that whatever the circumstances of the day that we met, he put us in business and became an anchor investor in all of our funds, and forever admire him. The second one, which I had the good fortune of meeting, and he's controversial, but he had a wonderful quote, which I think became the eponymous title of a book, which was Jim Watson. Jim wasn't overly impressive. He was a smart guy, obviously notorious and infamous for some of the things he said, but for his co-discovery of the helical structure of DNA with Rosalind Franklin, who didn't get enough credit, and Francis Crick. But he had this wonderful line, which was 3 words, and it had 2 meanings: avoid boring people. And I've always loved that because I had tea with him in his apartment near the UN, and it was just such a great admonishment, which was avoid being boring to people and avoid people who are boring. And I find myself drawn towards interesting people and having a motive force to be interesting to others.
This will sound really cliche, but for me, I'm sitting here talking to both of you because I was inspired when I was very young by Steve Jobs. I had a chance to meet Steve Jobs several times when I was working at Adobe on what became the Acrobat and PDF projects. Steve had a really great relationship with John Warnock, who had been one of the founders of Adobe, and he would come over to see what we were doing. I would go to all the early Mac worlds. I joke the reason I'm doing what I'm doing is I fell in love with Mac Paint, when the original Macintosh came out. But the thing that I loved about Steve Jobs the most was that he seemed to ignore all of the skeptics and the critics, and exactly what we talked about at the beginning of this show. He did the right thing for what he felt was the right place to go, right? He wanted to bring creativity to the masses. He wanted to do things the way he wanted to do them. And he pretty much, ignored conventional wisdom and showed a lot of us that you could do that and be successful. You didn't have to have all the data. You didn't have to follow the crowd. You didn't have to do things the way that you've always done them. And so I found a lot of great personal inspiration from that. And the thing that most struck me about him was I don't think I've ever met anyone with as much charisma as Steve Jobs. He just was dripping with showmanship and the ability to persuade, which is incredibly invaluable in our industry.
In the late 1960s, ARPA, a research branch of the Department of Defense, set out to connect remote terminals over long distances. The idea was to establish a network in case traditional lines of communication went down in a devastating military strike. They were working on a piece of wartime technology. They invented the internet. Economists believe that over 90% of all economic growth over our entire history as a species can be traced back to technological progress. But much of that progress has its roots in conflict. Aircraft technology surged forward during World War I, and when we discovered the power of nuclear fission, We weren't striving to provide clean, carbon-free energy to millions of homes. In other words, the technology that's driven our world for millennia, good and bad, is agnostic. It's human beings that must decide whether we use it to hurt people or to help them. Any one of the now giddy from lack of sleep people in this room could be on the cusp of a powerful discovery. Whether that invention is a threat or a gift to everyone else depends on leaders. Leaders who know how to spot someone on the brink of a powerful new idea. Leaders who can nurture them as that idea develops. And leaders who can shape and guide that individual so that when the sketch in their notebook becomes a reality, it's something that benefits us all. Because as Josh, Mike, and many others know, technology may be powerful. But at the end of the day, it's people who will decide where humanity goes from here. And going in the right direction will always hinge on having driven, thoughtful, and empathetic leaders to guide us there.
World Reimagined with Gautam Mukunda, a leadership podcast for a changing world, an original podcast from Nasdaq.
Gautam Mukunda does not speak on behalf of Rose Park Advisors, LLC, or any of its affiliates, and is not soliciting investments or providing investment advice.